Hello and welcome to Andrew Lownie. Andrew, you and I have met before, and we met at, I think it was a mutual friend's party, a birthday party some years ago. And I have always known you as the very highly respected author of several books. And in fact, not just about spies and things like that, but also an author of books on the royal family. For example, the Mountbattens, one of the books, again, a superbly well researched book of yours. And it was all about, they turned out to have probably one of the happiest marriages of any of the royal families with an open marriage. Then you had.
Exactly. Maybe there's a new model there.
Yeah, well, exactly. Very possibly. Well, they may as well all come clean about whatever they're up to anyway. Then there was, of course, the great love story, the Wallace and the Duke of Windsor, and of course the most recent one, and the one that you have explored and exposed. Which was regarded, and maybe still is, well, I don't know about how they feel now, but the happiest divorced couple within the royal family.
Yes, I mean, as I say, the trilogy is about looking at royal marriages. It allows you to talk about both the private and public life, but of course look at other things, including the way that the narrative has been curated, really, in royal history, and we haven't always got the full story. And it's also these books about establishment cover-ups, which is sort of what's been happening with Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. The book is about, I suppose, corruption, financial corruption at the heart of the royal family, and how that's been basically enabled and protected for many years until now.
And why do you think that? Actually, before I even go into the why do you think that is, let's start from the very beginning here, because what was it that made you decide that Andrew himself and Fergie were to be the subject of a book for you?
Well, there hadn't really been a book ever on them. I mean, she'd had a sort of authorized biography done many years ago. There'd been a few sort of cuttings jobs done on him over the years, mainly from his time in the Falklands, and then one more recent one. And, I just knew from reading the papers that there was a much bigger story there, and that if one did a bit of digging, one might be able to find it, which is exactly what happened.
Yes, of course. I recall some years ago when there were stories being leaked about his financial corruption in, I think it was the Middle East, was it initially?
Yes, well, I mean, I think no, Central Asia, in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, there was a story, for example, of him taking a 3.85 million pound commission for introducing a Greek water company into Kazakhstan. But there've been lots of rumors about his activities and indeed those of his daughters and ex-wife in the Middle East, where, of course, they have perhaps different standards of operating.
Okay, now there are some who are saying that beneath all of this is your desire to just get rid of the royal family. Is that the
Yeah,
case?
no, not at all.
Of
No, I
course.
mean, I hope that the book is balanced. I've actually asked if they wanted to cooperate with it to start with to help shape the narrative. I'm a monarchist. I do believe that they do a great job, but it's for that reason I feel that some of these bad apples need to be called out.
Yes.
I don't think we should turn a blind eye to corruption of the royal family just because one supports the institution.
I love that answer. Absolutely right. Full on with you with that. It's just it was something that there have been so many incidences or instances rather where people have said that. Oh, he just doesn't like the idea of a royal family. And I've argued that point quite heavily because I have read your other works as well and know full well that you are indeed a monarchist. As am I should say right now. But yes, you're quite right. Bad apples should be flushed out or at least exposed so that, it either doesn't happen again or that they cease behaving the way that, well,
Yeah,
that
I
would
think
have
they were
had.
undermining the good work that all the others did. And
Yes.
I think that was the reason that King Charles a few weeks ago said that they had to sort of basically cut loose this damaged limb in order to save the body politic.
Of course. Um, Now, What do you think? I mean, Andrew's already been stripped of all his titles, his home that he's lived in for many, many years. Um, what do you feel? Because people are still calling for his head. What do you feel the next stage should be?
Well, I mean, I think, there are calls for him to be investigated, both of them to be investigated on a whole series of charges, and I think they should go through with that. That didn't happen before. And, clearly, if those charges hold, they should be, put on trial and, if necessary, convicted. I don't think anyone is above the law, including ex-members of the royal family. I don't think he's going to go on trial. He'll run away to Dubai before then. But I think that's probably the next stage to assuage public opinion, which has sort of been ahead of the palace and indeed even the media at times,
Yes.
in the need for these people to be held to account. It's the same thing that's going on in the States with Trump, and it's all part of, I suppose, people power, which has been shaped by social media and the non-mainstream media, to call these people to account.
Yes, and but there are also, I mean, there are so many intricacies within this entire story. And can you give us an idea of how many years of research? And I know you interviewed or you approached over 3,000 people, and quite a large number came forward, I think, around 10%.
Yes, we had about 300 people I interviewed. About 150 of them are on the record in the book. Another 150 are unnamed sources. But actually, a lot of those people have said that for the paperback, which comes out next summer, they're prepared to be named. So
Wow.
that's encouraging because
Yeah.
most royal books, you're lucky if you get five or six.
Yes, indeed. And the interesting thing as well, though, is, and this was how you got so much incredibly good, valuable, powerful factual information, that the fact that many of these people who didn't know each other corroborated stories and so on.
Yes, I mean it had to be double sourced, so in
Sure.
order to get through the lawyers, so they were very careful. I had to have people signing off on things, and there were stories I couldn't clearly run the paper because there was a single source and people didn't always trust them. So that was, that was frustrating because there were a lot of stories, for example, on Mandelson, and his relationship with Epstein that had to come out, which in fact have been proved to be true. We had stories about Fergie's long association with Epstein long after she claimed to have cut off ties, which again, I didn't have the corroborative proof, but I've now got. So there'll
Yes.
be a lot of new material in the paperback as a result of the book coming out. A lot of people have come forward with fresh stories. So it's been it's been a very interesting experience.
I imagine that there will probably be even more information coming forward with all of the thousands of new emails that have been released as well.
Yes, I'm excited by that. I mean, we're not really going to get everything. A lot's been redacted. A lot will be kept back because there's still part of his claim of crime investigation. But I think we'll have a whole series of new leads, and that may well bring other people forward to talk. I think there's still some legal depositions which could be unsealed. So I think this story is far from over.
Oh, absolutely. I have to say, I hang on the news every single day for, the latest, that's the latest expose or whatever. And certainly when it comes to the Epstein files, it's quite surprising that there are so many people whose names have not yet come forward or come out, but more and more are doing so. And I found it interesting that Fergie, I mean, can you take us through how Epstein got together? Was it through Ghislaine first? How Andrew and Fergie came to be part of Epstein's entourage?
Well, I think that the relation the connections are not very clear. I mean, the conventional line is that Ghislaine knew Andrew, and then Ghislaine introduced Epstein to Andrew because clearly she knew him already. I think it's much more likely it came through Sarah Ferguson. Sarah Ferguson and Ghislaine were sort of big social figures in New York in the 1990s, and they would have met. Ghislaine herself says, I think it came through Sarah Ferguson, and I think that was the route. So she knew Sarah Ferguson. Sarah Ferguson introduced Ghislaine to Andrew, and Ghislaine introduced Andrew to Epstein.
Now, in your book, entitled. Um, there are elements that, I was driving along here in Japan and I have the audiobook and I'm listening to all your details in there. And one of the bits that really did quite surprise me was the way that it seemed Fergie was a little more than surprised when she gets back and she finds that Andrew is, I think, is he naked and his friend just has a pair of underpants on and they're on the sofa.
Yes, I mean that there have been lots of those sort of stories, and Sarah Ferguson herself claimed that she'd started them herself for as a joke. I mean, this is a report in I'd say a pretty down market paper, so I sort of trailed it there. But it's very difficult to find sort of first-hand evidence to support those stories. I mean, there's certainly, I've received a lot of information about his bisexuality, but not enough really to put in the book and feel that it's absolutely authentic.
Well, I have to say that a friend of mine's daughter, who was their nanny at one point, actually did say to me once that she said that Andrew is far more into boys than
Oh,
men than women.
interesting.
So, and she was
Well,
their nanny. So I'll put her in touch with you.
would the nanny speak to me?
I don't know. I'll see.
Oh,
I'll
that
see
would
if
be
I can.
wonderful.
I haven't heard from her for years, and this was, when she said this was the early 2000s. So I'll find out. I'll see if I can track her down
Oh,
and
well, that would be
put her in
wonderful.
touch
Thank
with
you.
you.
Yes, that's just the sort of, first-hand testimony one needs.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And that was at a time when there were no rumors about anything. And even at the time, I remember thinking, oh gosh, and of course the teddy bears, lots of teddy bears,
Yes.
which she thought were the daughters. Now, I think there was a period of 30 years or so that, well, there is a phenomenal chemistry between Fergie and Andrew, even post marriage, even when, long after they were a couple. They've had this phenomenal chemistry, a little bit like when you get the Bonnie and Clydes and all these sorts of characters, the Fred and Rose West, these sorts of characters that when they get together, things happen. Do you think there was that sort of chemistry that was the situation with between Andrew and Fergie?
Well, I think there was an instant physical attraction. I think they were both slightly on the rebound from other relationships, under pressure both to settle down. I mean, the marriage unraveled pretty quickly. They were both having affairs quite quickly. I'm slightly more cynical. I mean, I think she kind of hung in there because that was given her basically her business model was to be part of the royal family. And so that's why she stayed at Royal Lodge. I mean, it's interesting, as soon as he's lost his title and left Royal Lodge, he's no longer wants to be with him. I mean, they always had very separate lives. I mean, they had separate relationships. So it was a sort of business partnership. I mean, they would say they were there co-parenting as well, allowed the children to see both parents. But I think it was a business relationship, and I think Bonnie and Clyde probably sums it up best. You
Mm.
know, they were partners in crime.
Yes. Well, that's actually what I meant. Do you think that they would have been as as bad, if you like, as they have, had they not have come together?
No, I think it's very interesting. If Andrew had married Stark, which is what he wanted to do, I think that it would have been slightly different. I mean, it was
Mm.
because of Sarah Ferguson's extravagance, of her getting into debt, that he was in some ways forced sometimes into these relationships, like with Epstein, who paid off Sarah Ferguson's debts. So I think it might have unraveled in a different way. I mean, she was very greedy. She had no real moral boundaries, and he's the same. He's always wanted to play with the sort of jet set, and so they kind of brought out the worst characteristics in each other.
Well, I suppose there's the thing. Both of them seem to have an incredible lack of empathy when it comes to the consequences of what they're doing. Even, if they were to think two steps ahead and the effect of all of this coming out on their children, on the rest of their family, their friends, and so on. Where do you think that lack of empathy comes from? And do you think that the two of them together somehow almost managed to negate any concerns about that lack of empathy.
Yes, I mean, I think they're both narcissists. I mean, I think the fact that Andrew has never really apologized for his behavior or sought to explain it in any way. She's the same. I think they're very much focused on their own interests and needs. And, that's what's given them the problems that they've got. I mean, I don't think Andrew feels anything at the moment in terms of his lost reputation, except, frustration that he's no longer able to stand on the balcony at Buckingham Palace.
Wow. See, that's quite staggering, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that would certainly seem to be the case because it seems that he was, I mean, he seemed quite cocky, to be fair, until we saw that clip with Prince William rubbing his nose and clearly saying something in return in response to Andrew at it was a recent funeral, I believe, wasn't it? And it was quite clear then that the royal family were distancing themselves from Andrew.
Yes, I mean, I don't think Prince William has any time for Prince Andrew, and I think both personally and he can see the damage he's doing to the reputation of the royal family. So, there was Andrew trying to cozy up to him to show that they were all part of a happy family and he had the family support, and it was very clear that he didn't. And that clearly was going on in the background. But I think with King Charles's statement a few weeks ago, that's really made it very clear that they don't want to have any association with him. He's no longer a member of the family, and if charges are brought, he will not be sort of bringing them into disgrace. They want nothing more to do with him.
Yes, and it's quite interesting. Something that I had read just recently, or come across just recently, was that Epstein had also, his PR firm had advised him to cut ties with Prince Andrew when Andrew was a prince.
Yes, I mean, I think King Charles had the measure of him. I mean, they didn't quite know what to do with him when he left the Navy, and Charles said, if you make him trade envoy, he'll spend his time playing golf and chasing women and trying to make money. But he was overridden by the Queen and by the Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair. Indeed, interestingly enough, by Peter Mandelson, who is a close friend of Andrew's. And I think we've now seen all the problems that have emerged as a result of that.
Yes, indeed. And of course, Mandelson, he was forced into resignation, I think, well, three times now, the most recent one being the third time. I have to say, I was extremely surprised that Starmer brought him back in any way after, the dreadful things that he did back in the day when he'd borrowed, was it 370 odd thousand pounds as a secret loan, an interest-free secret loan, I believe, at the time.
Yeah, I mean, Peter Mandelson, I mean, there have been, is clearly a sort of very Marmite figure. And I mean, he's clearly got good contacts. He's a very effective operator. And I think that's why Starmer appointed him. But I agree, it was a very dangerous appointment given his backstory. And they may well, and the people knew about his associations with Epstein and seemed to have ignored them. So,
Yeah.
in some ways, shows the importance of doing diligence on these appointments to avoid embarrassment in the future. I think the problem was also Starmer kind of thought he could save Mandelson, and then when he realized he couldn't, had to dispatch him pretty quickly.
I'm still, no matter what in my mind he thought of Mandelson, ultimately the man has been proven to be a rogue twice before, a rogue financially with his financial dealings, to put him in a situation where people can actually ultimately buy access to others through someone like him.
Yeah.
It's so
Yeah,
dangerous.
well, I think this is all part of cleaning out the stables that I think the public feel very strongly about. And Andrew is part of that, and Epstein clearly was a large part of that. But we're seeing it to say with things going on in the States, there is a new mood. I think that these elites have been basically operating just in their own interests, and lots of things have been covered up. And it sort of plays to my story over the last 10 years that there is this curated narrative, and rich and powerful people have kind of shaped it. I hope there will be change and a bit more transparency and openness.
And do you feel that with the Epstein files coming out, I'm sorry to keep popping back to the Epstein stuff, but the Epstein files, in a way, have also played quite a large part in the rot, if you like, that Andrew and Fergie have flirted with for many, many years. And do you do you feel that it is currently or has currently been fair that it is only Andrew that has come through this badly scathed, and that others so far don't seem to have come through it too badly? I mean, Mandelson, he's lost his role through it, but there doesn't seem to be much else.
Well, I think, there've been selective leaks, which are focused on Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, who both, of course, suffered from it. I mean, the story has been focused on the British side. I think we'll now see lots of American names appear, and indeed perhaps some more British names, with the release of the documents. So Andrew was sort of low-hanging fruit. It was easy. The press had that sort of had their teeth into him. But I think, there will be fresh disclosures for lots of other people, and that will sort of open up the whole story.
I can't wait. It's going to be a very exciting time, I think, over the next few months. And who knows, maybe, mind you, having said all of that, Andrew, it's also possible that because the files have been released now, that Trump will be able to do with them what he wants.
Yes, I mean, I think, it's pretty clear that all the mentions of Trump in the files have been taken out, and indeed probably references to other Republicans. So it's a sort of it's been used as a political weapon,
Mm.
and I think it's very sad when records are destroyed, and we only get a partial picture. But something is better than nothing.
That's very true. And there are many copies apparently elsewhere, unfortunately, probably in Russia and other countries. Now, I came across something recently where it is possible that Fergie and possibly Andrew thought that their lives might be in danger. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the story from a source was that Epstein became very paranoid. He was worried that they would kind of spill the beans on him and that they needed to be taken out. It doesn't mean that this actually, how far this plan went. I mean, I understand there was a sniper who'd been trained in British Special Forces, a bit like the Day of the Jackal.
Yeah.
Um, but it's very difficult to stand this up, and so I'm just waiting for more more information to come to me. So it's something we dropped into the Substack just to sort of see trail it really.
Yes. Do tell people where to find your Substack, where to find all the information.
Well, it's called the Lownie Report, and it's free, so people can sign up. But a lot of new material is being placed on that to stuff I couldn't use in the book.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, the Loney Report, fantastic. And let's go back to the relationship, if you don't mind, with between Fergie and Andrew. And even after they had got together, and in fact, after their divorce, they had a relationship whereby they would still, for some reason, get quite angry and possessive over each other, I gather, or what each other were doing. Um, which of them was the one that got angrier than the other, and why? Was it that Fergie was
I think
possessive?
Sarah was the one.
Right.
Yeah, I think Sarah, was happy for, she could have affairs, but she didn't like the idea of Andrew having affairs. And of course, that always risked another woman coming on the scene and her position being sort of downgraded. So I think she was the one who kind of manipulated him, made him feel guilty for being a poor husband, colluded often with people like the Queen to kind of see off girlfriends. So I think it was very similar to Edwina Mountbatten. I mean, she had her own relationships, but didn't like Louis having his. And I think that was replicated here. And she was very successful. I mean, Andrew really hasn't had any long-term relationships since the marriage broke up 30 years ago.
Wow. Yes. Okay. So there's so very duplicitous in that way, really, and
Yeah, I mean,
double
there are a lot of
standards.
comments from members of staff, how she played off people against each other. She was very good at getting back in with, for example, other members of the royal family, having been kind of cast aside when Prince Philip was there. So, uh, she's a I always think of her like a Becky Sharp from Vanity Fair. She's got sharp elbows and she sort of gets back in there. Remember, I mean, she was caught selling access to Andrew in 2010.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't have thought she come back from that. I mean, you talk about Mandelson, and yet, she went on Oprah and there she was back in the royal family at Ascot and Royal Wimbledon, etc.
I think what I find really amazing is the number of times I hear from all sorts of different people that how charismatic she is when you meet her in person and how she can work a room and she's really very charming and can hold an audience and so on. And yet when I've seen her in television programs or things like that on screen, I haven't actually felt that when she's being interviewed. She's never come across as particularly bright. Is she?
No, no, she's not bright. I mean, I think she's quite savvy. I mean, I've met her, and she's a force of nature.
Mhm.
And you are like a sort of a puppy dog, really, and you're sort of drawn into her. I think a lot of it is quite false, and I think the problem with the TV programs is she's not very good at listening to people. She's kind of on transmit.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem. I don't know how genuinely interested she is in people. It's all about, in some ways, her own ego, and that's not going to work as a television presenter.
No, and what she can get out of those people, I'm guessing, as well.
Yes, I mean, yeah, she's a great networker. I mean, that was the problem with her charities. She was using the charities for her own social ambitions, and indeed to undercut a lot of her business activities. So, for example, she set up a charity in the States, but ran her office through the charity, which of course that wasn't paying tax and had a subsidized rent and all sorts of things. So, she doesn't always know where the boundaries lie in some of these things.
Do you think that that is her thinking that she's above the law in some way or another? Or do you think that that might be just her being just a little bit too slack and not taking on advisors, not realizing that they would know better?
Well, I mean, both of them have lots of advisors. They don't always listen to them, but I'm afraid it's the former. I think she doesn't really have moral boundaries. I mean, both of them don't feel the rules exist for them. They can flout them. And, they have for many years and not been caught, and it's only now catching up with them. So I don't think this is ignorance. This is deliberate. There's some bits where she's a bit scatty, and I know that she's, for example, paid charities from her own monies. But at the same time, there's an awful lot of very cynical operations. Doing charity events, forbidding the press, only having Hello magazine there, then paying her a huge sum for an interview, or her expenses actually basically being more than any monies raised by the charity. So, and this has been going on for a long time, and I'm sure has been pointed out to her. So, I think she's just found a way to work the system.
Wow. And I mean, I must admit, I'm always, I don't know if it's shock or awe, the way that she makes a comeback every time. She's like one of these characters that reinvents herself, like a Madonna, but of the bad world. She sort of pops back up again as something new with a new project and new ways of making another fortune in some way or another. Where do you think she gets that from?
Yeah,
And
well, I mean that's well, I think she's a survivor, and that's what particularly American audiences like, that she can pick herself up from the floor and reinvent herself. And she did this after her divorce, and became a spokeswoman for Weight Watchers very successfully, and lost weight herself. She has done a good job, for example, for Wedgwood China. But I think, now with the association with Epstein, I think she is pretty tainted, and it's going to be very difficult for her to win back trust. I mean, there are already stories of her trying to remarket herself as a motivational speaker, but I don't think people are going to buy it. I think a bit like Ann Mandelson, she's run out of lives.
Yes, yes. Maybe they need a few years off again until a few people forget or something. But it's interesting because, of course, she was writing books and things. But even one of those, I think she stole the material, didn't she?
Yes, I mean she's done written lots of books, lots of children's books. I mean the first one, Budgie the helicopter, was then discovered to be based on a book called Hector the Helicopter. It's very close. The other publisher didn't pursue any sort of plagiarism action, but I think that certainly tainted her. She then said the monies were going to charity. It turned out they weren't. And in the past, royals, whenever they've done books, the monies had to always go to charity. And same with photographic sort of spreads in magazines. And she kind of broke the mold there. She took the money for herself, or gave it, in fact, with the Hello case, to her mother. So, and since then,
That
she's relied on
charity.
ghostwriters for most of her books. That's
Yes.
charity indeed. Well, that was what she argued.
No,
It was to her
yes,
mother.
no, I was saying
Um,
that
but
charity, as in her mother. Oh gosh. Yeah. Uh,
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, her mother and father also were pretty profligate. I mean, they ended up in debt. They say they had the same sort of. I mean, they both had affairs. I mean, she didn't have great role models to give her an example.
it's interesting, isn't it, when you compare the upbringing of both Andrew and Fergie, that both of them had fathers who were quite domineering, mothers who were either all over them like a rash or not there. And of course, in Fergie's case, she was completely abandoned. What was she, 12 or 13 or so?
Yes, I mean, she makes a big point of the fact that her mother left to go off with Hector Barrantes to Argentina when she was 12 or 13, and as a result, she has low self-esteem and she's overeaten, and she wants to be a people pleaser. But my own mother's mother died when she was 11, and my mother didn't turn out like that. So I think this is kind of special pleading. Plenty of people lose their mothers at a young age, and don't have the privileges that she had. So I think she's kind of playing the victim, as she often does. And I'm not sure that it really justifies her behavior.
Right. Okay. And for I suppose I'm looking for some kind of rationale as to, I mean, was she ever sexually abused when she was younger? Is that why she was so promiscuous? Is that why she tended to go for older men? Paddy McNally, for example.
Yes, yes, no, she has gone for older men, and she was sexually promiscuous. I mean, I don't know what the factors were there. I mean, there was a very strange relationship with her father, who actually called her Ginger Bush. So there was a sort of slightly sexualized element to the relationship with the father. He himself was very promiscuous. So I think possibly, she saw both her parents having affairs and felt that there was nothing wrong with that, and that's the sort of model she followed. And she's a very sort of earthy, sexual woman. And I think, I suppose as long as no one knew about it, that sort of worked. I mean, I think, Andrew knew what was going on, and I think everyone just turned a blind eye to both their affairs as long as it was secret.
And in the case of Andrew, so he was packed off to boarding school quite early on, wasn't he, in his life? How old was he?
Well, he went off, I think, at the age of 7 to Heatherdown, which was normal in those days. I mean, it was quite close to Ascot, and the Queen used to come and visited him. But there were stories I picked up that he himself was in effect sexually abused while he was there. He was taken off to a brothel by the father of one of his friends, and uh,
At what age?
I think that might explain his. Well, I think at the age of 11, they said. Now, I mean, this seems surprising to us, but I'm told it does happen. And it'd be very interesting to see if one could get further evidence to support that. But that would explain his need for constant sexual gratification, his inability to establish relationships, his interest in prostitutes. Um,
Mm.
so it's again one of those things that one wishes one could have a full picture. One just has little sort of elements that are presented.
And do you think that he thinks there's anything wrong with his behavior, or because there are so many elements to this that could have been catastrophic for the royal family. For example, all the prostitutes that would come into Buckingham Palace without any security checks. All that sort of thing must have been, or could have been potentially an absolute nightmare. And we don't even know, maybe some of it has been a nightmare for the royal family.
Well, I think the extraordinary thing is the Queen seemed to know about these prostitutes brought in without security checks and turned a blind eye to it. I mean, this is what's so extraordinary that she put her own family ahead of the monarchy, which is not the story we've been told. But clearly there was a huge security risk with these women coming in and wandering around unescorted, and it makes a farce of all the security arrangements that they have. And Paul Page, one of the policemen on the North Gate, has gone very public about this, but I've heard it from other policemen as well. So yeah, an extraordinary thing that, and of course people were being entertained at Buckingham Palace, businessmen and things like that. These are not meant to be uh, palaces, which of course the public pay for to serve the personal interests of the monarchy. They're there to serve the public interest.
Yes, of course. And you've just reminded me of something else that I found extraordinary in your book, but it's all corroborated and evidenced and so on. And that was the alcohol bill, the alcohol bills alone that Fergie would run up. They ran into thousands. Do tell us.
Yes, I mean she has very expensive tastes in wine, particularly. I mean she's quite a heavy drinker, and certainly, for example, the bar bills at hotels often exceeded the cost of the accommodation. She's very wasteful. I mean, she buys expensive wines, opens a bottle, and then leaves them half empty. She's very generous, particularly in terms of entertaining people. So I think there was a bill at one of the wine merchants in London of many thousands each week. Um, uh, and she wouldn't think anything of throwing a party, for example, for the workmen working on her house, a champagne tea party. So, she has these sort of ideas of grandeur, shall we say, which are kind of, she couldn't sustain with the income she had, particularly after she got divorced. So this is an attempt to kind of play with the big boys, to big herself up. She finds it very difficult to make choices. If she likes a jersey, she'll buy all eight of them. She'll buy things to try and ready to return, and then she won't bother returning them and be charged. So there are lots and lots of these things which just come down to very chaotic lifestyle and her indecisiveness.
I wonder where all that starts. I wonder, how did that actually begin? Because that's quite a kind of cataclysmic kind of state of damage to be in, isn't it? When you have no boundaries, when you can't decide what you like or what you don't like. And let's go into one more area, because I'm always fascinated by things like this. I have come across people, in fact, who have these fantasy relationships. And in your book, and funnily enough, I was driving along the bottom of Mount Iwati, not very far away from me here, which is a volcanic mountain. And I was listening to you effectively telling me through your book, as you will with all listeners of the book, about how she was so into John F. Kennedy, for example, at one particular point, or whoever else, some other man or other that she may not even have ever met, and yet would ask a friend, well, do you think he would get upset if I wore this instead of that, or if I went here or there, or describe some of that obsessiveness within her nature?
Yeah, well, and she is very insecure, and she, has a lot of sort of confidence. She used psychics, for example, to sort of run things by about relationships, or particularly whether she should leave Andrew, whether her relationships with other men, her role in the royal family, and I mean, could spend hours and hours on the phone to them. But I think also she has, as you say, these fantasy relationships, people like Kevin Costner, Tiger Woods, John F. Kennedy Jr. in which she kind of imagined herself in their lives, and she would actually follow them across the world. With Tiger Woods, she chased around America. Thomas Muster, the Austrian tennis player, she went to Australia to see. Um, and I think it is, she talks about fairy tales a lot. She is a little girl that hasn't really grown up. And I suppose this helps her control the narrative in a world that perhaps she doesn't fully understand, and is very, it's very romantic. But weird things. So, for example, with John F. Kennedy, she in effect stalked him when he rejected her, just to see that he was actually with his girlfriend, and had wild ideas that she would marry him, he'd become president of the United States, she'd become the first lady. She talked to a man called Alan Starkey, who was again a confidant in her as a business associate, saying that if he tried to commit suicide again, which he tried once, and he went to heaven, he should pass on a message to John F. Kennedy Sr. So very, very weird behavior. And I think this makes the book so fascinating, the characters so
Yes.
fascinating because they do have these very strange quirks.
Absolutely. And I can see your book, the details and information within it, with a great scriptwriter becoming a movie blockbuster because we'd all be there glued wanting to watch it. So many fascinating areas. For example, Andrew, at the start of his life, he's already showing elements to about his character that his mother is covering up for. And I suppose in that instance, we would say, I'm a mother, and there might be things that you might cover up for your kids. Luckily, I haven't had to. And most people don't, because your kids can be naughty and they can be good and all the rest of it. But do you wonder whether the Queen thought or knew that there was something not quite right with this son of hers?
Yes, I think that is a part of it. I mean, the Queen protected him, I think, because she realized he was more vulnerable. I mean, stranger, there were concerns even when he was first born. He was kept away from public view because I think there were concerns about him, and that there is something very odd about him and his behavior. And I don't know, a psychiatrist could perhaps explain it, perhaps after they've read the book. But he was described as the runt of the litter, and I think that is a strong part of it. That the Queen realised that and needed that, and I think was much more sympathetic to him, and maybe was prepared to over to
Compensate.
gnaw bits of his behaviour because of that.
Yes, and of course Prince Philip was much harsher with him, wasn't he?
Yes, I think Prince Philip, he was the one who could see, for example, that Andrew needed to give up his royal status when the Newsnight interview had run and the case was being brought. So he was much more hard-headed about this and practical. Um, I think Andrew was a sort of alpha male like him, liked sport, quite direct. I mean, Andrew in many ways has modeled himself on his father, putting his hands behind his back, a role like Charles does too. But the very sort of direct approach to people, accusatory approach almost. So I think, there was quite a strong bond between them. But I think Philip realized the reputational damage much earlier than I think other members of the royal family.
Yes, it's interesting that in some ways he modelled himself on his father, but physically, this is from a female perspective, physically, I think he shows every sign of his greed and everything because his father never became a fat man, as neither did Prince Charles. There's always that element of self-respect and self-regard, and it's as though Andrew doesn't have any of those boundaries, even with regard to his own physical self.
Yes, I mean, I think, I think as you say, because he was indulged and not disciplined, he just does what suits him, and he didn't, for example, feel he needed to attend roll call at Gordonston. I've heard stories of him in golf clubs where you're not meant to have your mobile, and he ignores that and makes calls. So he's just got used to no one really telling him off, and I think that's part of the problem. That I think when people did try and tell him off, for example, in the Navy, they found their careers were curtailed. And this is why, it is a bigger problem, just Andrew. It's about how, he was allowed to operate for many years, knowing that what he was doing was wrong.
Do you think he will ever change his behaviour?
Well, he's a man of 65 now. I think it's going to be very difficult. He had opportunities over the last 10, 15 years to sort of pay penance for his behavior, to apologize to the victims, to do charitable work. And he's done none of those things. So I don't think he is going to change. I think, the book is called Entitled, and I think that really sums him up. I think he will probably fade from public view, and it will probably be forgotten about. And I think he will still try and do his business activities, etc. But I don't think he's going to change in terms of his character, nor do I think Sarah Ferguson is. She, feels that she's entitled to this, even though she's not a member of the royal family, and she will find some way of making money off the back of her, public position role.
I would love to find a psychiatrist or a psychologist who has read your book and interview them and find out, the kind of the deeper wiring up that might possibly have gone horribly wrong in both their heads. It just seems just unreal the level of lack of empathy. Well, narcissism, really.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I wanted to get psychiatrists to read the book and to give their comments, either as you say on a podcast or even in the book itself. And I was told that they need to really interview the person individually. They can't just rely on secondhand information. But I agree. I mean, I think you would, someone who's skilled could see a pattern of behavior here
Mm.
and explain it for both of them because they are, I think, very interesting case studies in um, uh, unusual behavior, shall we say?
Yeah, very much so. And I wonder if either of them have a psychiatrist that they go to see.
Well, certainly, Sarah's been to psychiatrists after the 2010 episode when she was caught selling access to Andrew. Um, I think the line from the palace was that she should go and see someone, and she did. She went to a practice in Paddington, and I suspect over the years she's continued to use. I mean, in the way she used psychics to go to psychiatrists. I doubt Andrew has gone to counselling. I think the two daughters have gone to counselling to deal with some of the sort of bad publicity of their parents, um, and
How
that
do
would
you?
be perfectly understandable.
Yes. Sorry, we've got a slight lag, I know, because I'm all the way over in Japan and you're in the UK, so there's that little crossover. So I do apologise there. Um,
It's okay.
how? Thank you. How do you think the two daughters are dealing with this?
Well, I just don't know. I mean, I think clearly, understandably, they're pretty distraught by the reputational damage to them as well as to their parents. Clearly, they are concerned about their parents' mental health. I mean, they both lost. I mean, particularly Sarah Ferguson. She's lost everything that really counted for her. The home, the opportunity to make money in the future, her title. Uh, I think there's sort of two ways they can go. One is to just totally cut themselves adrift, to give up their titles and to live a quiet life of just with their careers and their families. The other is to try and, which I think is the one that they will do, is to kind of hope that the whole thing will settle down, to retain their titles, which of course give them a great deal of useful influence, for example, in business in the Middle East,
Yes.
and hope that business can resume as normal once the whole story has died down.
Well, and there, of course, is another thing. More and more information will come out in the Epstein files. And it'll be interesting to see who else is implicated. Now, we haven't talked yet about Virginia Giuffre or Giuffre. How do you pronounce her name?
Well, I don't know. I'm criticized. I said Giuffre. Others have said Giuffre. I just don't know. I think don't. No one seems to know.
Okay.
Um, so Virginia,
Well,
we can call her.
we'll call her Virginia. Well, Virginia Giuffre anyway. I'll stick with Giuffre because that's how I've been pronouncing it. Now, I am halfway through her book currently, and I have to say, I didn't want to read her book. I didn't want to, and I don't know why. I think it was because I felt as though, well, she wasn't a child at the time. The jurisdiction in the UK is different to the US with regard to when you can have sex. She knew what she was going to, and things like that. So I had a slightly harsh view, really. And then I was thinking, and she did very well getting £12 million out of it. And all of that. So I couldn't help but be a little bit skeptical. After the first chapter, I opened up she opened my heart rather. She really got me. The book of hers is written in such an open, heartfelt way, and a woman very much in dreadful pain. Anybody who was a little bit skeptical as I was, I would say, read the book and then maybe you might change your mind, as I have. Why do you think he was so unprepared and so foolish in his interview with the BBC when all of the information came out about Virginia Giuffre?
Well, I mean, I think, he was used to getting away with bad behavior. He thought he could do it again. He was advised not to do the Newsnight interview, and he ignored that advice. And as you say, he wasn't prepared. Normally people would be coached to say all the right things. He told lies he didn't need to tell. And I think it was that very self-satisfied air to him that kind of put people off. So it was a disaster. And this is just back to this entitled, this sense of not being very bright and just doing things that suited him. And everything had been covered up in the past, and he thought that this would he would get away with it again. And of course, it just only turbocharged her really to come forward and with a civil suit. But I agree. I mean, I think it really brings home her book, the sort of human element to the story. I mean, it's often sort of described in the abstract. And here was a victim. I mean, whether she was acting as a prostitute because she was being paid. I mean, she had a pretty terrible, abusive youth. This was the only person, Ghislaine and Epstein, who'd shown her any kindness. And they were using her, but you could understand. She was still, if you see the pictures, she's still a very young waif-like girl.
Yes.
And for a man who joked that she was the same age as his children, it's pretty appalling
Yeah.
that he could behave like that. And it really brings home this sense of entitlement of all these people, not just Andrew, and the way that they just treated these vulnerable people as playthings who didn't matter.
Very much so. And of course, the book also very graphically implicates Ghislaine as being an abuser and a woman who would physically hurt with sex toys, hurt her and other girls who didn't do as they were told, which is quite shocking. And it's quite shocking as a
Yeah,
woman,
well, I mean,
reading this.
yeah, well, I mean, exactly. I mean, it was very clever. They had this very well-spoken woman as basically the procurer, which in a sense, people would have a sense of trust there. I think people feel that Ghislaine, some people feel she should get a pardon. I think she's lucky, to have only got 20 years. And, I think
And
it would be appalling if she was given a pardon just because she basically wrote Trump out of the script.
absolutely, yes. And of course, she has as well been moved. I think it's to an outdoor prison now, or well, obviously she sleeps indoors, but I mean, it's a prison that isn't a high security prison now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is all part of either releasing her quietly without anyone noticing or letting her escape. I'm not sure Trump can give her a pardon because I think that would play very badly with his sort of fan base. But I think that there's a very good chance that, she will disappear, and she will, get her freedom as a result of this deal.
Well, let's hope, because I think, we can't deny some people have quite conveniently seriously disappeared and been found dead. Epstein, for example, in his cell.
Yes, I mean, there have been a lot of mysterious deaths. I mean, we still don't know really the circumstances around Virginia Giuffre's suicide, but certainly I think that the feeling is that with Epstein's death, that it was not suicide, it was murder, and there's quite a lot of evidence, forensic and um, just the way it played out. So that will be, interesting. Several people, Jean-Luc Brunel, who was one of the model agency bosses, who was providing the girls, he died of suicide in prison. Several of the victims have committed suicide.
Yep.
So there are a
Looking
lot of
dodgy.
unexplained questions in this whole story. Yeah, a lot of
Absolutely.
unexplained stories.
Yes. And yeah, I mean, we don't even how did Jeffrey Epstein kill himself? Because what was the story that they put out about that?
Well, the story was that he committed suicide with his sheets in his cell. But I mean, one of the extraordinary things is that, he was on suicide watch, but his partner was moved out the day before. There's been no penalty for the head of the correctional facility. You would think losing a prisoner in those circumstances, there would be some inquiry. The guards fell asleep at the appropriate time when Epstein died. Cameras were switched off. Michael Baden, the coroner, has said it's the evidence of strangulation rather than of suffocation. And even the lawyers for the victims say that he was not a man he was at the beginning of his legal woes. He felt he could get out of it, not a man who was going to commit suicide. So, um,
Well, we've
I
all
think that,
seen,
there's so much in the story.
yes, of
Very
course.
convenient. A lot of, because clearly he may well have ratted on all sorts of people, and it was convenient for him not to be able to do that.
Exactly, and especially at a time when Trump was on the rise once more. It's interesting though that the post-mortem and so on, the findings were not clear. I mean, the findings were that he didn't necessarily commit suicide, weren't they?
Well, I don't think we've really seen the post-mortem, have we? I think that's one of the concerns that it wasn't made public,
Yes.
and that's why Mark Epstein's brother commissioned another one. I think that everything is been there've been statements put out, but I think we haven't really had the details. And I think his body was taken away. There weren't photographs supposedly taken. It just gives the impression of a cover-up. And that impression hasn't really changed. And I think if most people, I think now feel that he was killed.
Yes. Well, I think if we look at the footage of him when he is giving the interview to police, and he stands on the Fifth Amendment, on everything, and so on. It's interesting that when we see him, that is not a man that looks, "Oh, woe betide me! This is all too much for me. I'm going to top myself." It doesn't come across that way.
No, no. I mean, one of the problems with the case with Epstein is that so many of the people did plead Fifth Amendment. So all the people who worked around him, when they were asked questions, for example, about whether they had procured women, whether particularly for Prince Andrew, just to use the Fifth Amendment, the get out of jail free card. And so, I always feel they're using the Fifth Amendment. That's clearly they don't want to incriminate themselves. That's pretty good evidence of what was happening. But unfortunately, this has never really been tested in court. I think probably, I mean, that's why Andrew paid us 12 million to avoid that, because clearly there would have been other disclosures, more embarrassing disclosures. It was easier to pay someone off and hope the problem would go away.
Yes, okay. And of course, I'm just noting the time. We've got a couple of minutes really before we need to bring this to a close. And yet it's a fascinating subject, Andrew. And the book that you've written is just absolutely superb. And listeners and viewers out there, I cannot say enough good things about the work of Andrew Lownie on exposing everything to do with Andrew and Ferguson. And it's a great, absolutely a terrific read. We should do more on all of this. John Bryan, for example, the toe sucking side of things. He loved your book, and you thought he was going to hate it, didn't you?
Yes, extraordinary. Yes, I mean we're good friends now. I mean, always. I mean, he's a very charming man, and I think he tried to give advice to Sarah Ferguson, and she didn't listen. He's continued to remain in touch with her to this day. Um, and I think, he perhaps, is aware of some of the faults there. But yeah, no, extraordinary. I was slightly nervous because, I had to try and be as truthful as I could. And
Yes.
and I'd met John, I had dinner with him twice in LA. But I had to, explain that, he had not always behaved very well himself. But he didn't seem to worry about that. So that was good, because clearly a lot of people are upset by the book. And it's a very interesting response that he's had.
Yes, but then, it's he's an honest kind of guy, it would seem, and that comes through. And in the book, of course, he doesn't come across as necessarily the best of guys, but the fact that you and he are able to be friends now, and you just put a very honest, open information about him in the book is wonderful.
Well, I think he likes the attention. I suppose it was his moment in the limelight. I mean, clearly we're talking about events sometimes of 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But he's still around. He hasn't really changed. And he's a bit like Sarah Ferguson. He's a great survivor. But he was very useful to me. So was Alan Starkey, another of the financial advisors' lovers. He's Alan Starkey wrote a very good book on Sarah Ferguson, which she tried to ban in the 90s when she was publishing the first of her own autobiographies. And that those were very, very useful sources going back.
I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast here.
Pleasure.
Thank you, and let's hope we can do something again in the future. And I will see what I can do as well about getting you and the ex nanny from many years ago together. She may talk, you never know.
That would be wonderful. You never know. Well, I think brilliant if you did. Anyway, lovely to talk to you, and thanks so
And
much.
you, Andrew Lownie,
Okay.
thank you very much indeed.